Hello viewers, in this video I will try to give you a little insight about a poem called Fra Lippo Lippi. The poem Fra Lippo Lippi, it is an 1855 dramatic monologue written by the Victorian poet Robert Browning, which first appeared in his collection Men and Women. Throughout this poem, Browning has depicted a 15th century real life painter, Filippo Lippi. And through this poem, the poet has asked the question whether art should be true to life or an idealized image of life. Besides, this poem is also written in blank verse, non rhyming iambic pentameter, and a secondary theme of the dramatic monologue is the church's influence on art. Furthermore, uh, although Fra Lippo he paints real life pictures, it is the church that requires him to redo much of it, and instructive him to paint the soul, not the flesh. Okay, paint the soul, never mind the legs and arms. So this is the line from the poem. And aside from the theme of the church and its desires to change the way holiness is represented artistically, the poem also attempts to construct a way of considering the secular with the religious in terms of how a holy person can conduct his life. And questions of celibacy, church law, and the canon are considered as well by means of secondary characters. The poem begins as the painter and monk Lippo Lippi, also the poem's narrator, is caught by some authority figures while robbing his town's red light districts. And as he begins, he is being physically accosted by one of the police, and he accuses them of being overzealous and that he need not be punished. And it is not until he his name drops Cosimo of the Medici or from the ruling family of Florence as a nearby friend that he is released. Then he addresses himself specifically to the band's leader, identifying himself as the famous painter and then struggling that they are all himself included too quick to bow down to what authority figures suggest. Now free, he suggests that the listener allow his subordinates to wander off to their own devices. Then he tells how he had been busy the past 3 weeks, shut up in his room until he heard a band of merry revelers passing by and used a ladder to climb down to the streets to pursue his own fun. And it was while engaged in that fun that he was caught, and he defends himself to the judgmental listener, asking what from the poem this quotation is taken, that what am I beast for, if not to pursue his beastly appetites. And it is then that Lippo begins to tell his life story, and he was orphaned while still a baby and starved until his aunt gave him over to a convent. When the monks there asked if he was willing to renounce the world in service of monkhood, then Lippo was quick to agree, since renouncing the world meant a steady supply of food in the convent. Then he quickly took to the idleness of a monk's life even at 8 years old, but was undistinguished in any of the studies they had him attempt. And his one talent was the ability to recreate the faces of individuals through drawings, partially because as a starving child he was given great insight into the details that distinguish one face from another and the way those faces illustrated different characteristics. And instead of studying in the convent, he devoted himself to doodles and drawings until the prior noticed his talent and assigned him to be the convents artist. And as the convents artist, Lippo proceeded to paint a myriad of situations, all drawn from real world. And the common monks love his work, since in his artistry they could recognize images from their everyday lives. However, the prior and the learned do not admire Lippo's focus on realistic subjects, instead insisting that the artist's job is not to pay homage to the perishable clay of the flesh and body, but to transcend the body and attempt to reveal the soul. And they insist that he paints more saintly images, focusing on representation of praise and saintlessness instead of everyday reality. And Lippo protests to his listener that a painter can reveal the soul through representation of the body, since simple beauty is about the best thing God has invented. And Lippo identifies this as the main conflict of his otherwise privileged life, where he wants to paint things as they are. His masters insist his paint life from a moral perspective as much as he uh, hates it, and he must accuse to accuses to their wishes in order to stay successful, and hence he must go after prostitutes and other unsavory activity like the one he was caught involved in at poem's beginning. And as a boy brought up poor and in love with life, he cannot so easily forget his artistic impulse to represent life as he sees it to be. And he then speaks to the listener about what generations of artists owe one another, and how an artist who breaks new ground must always flaunt the conventions. Then he mentions a painter named Hulking Tom who studies under him, and who Lippo believes will further reinvent artistic practice in the way he himself has done through pursuing realism. Then he poses to his listener the basic question whether it is better to paint things just as they are, or to try to improve upon God's creations. Then he suggests that even in reproducing nature, the artist has the power to help people to see objects that they have taken for granted in a new light. Then he grows angry thinking of how his masters ruined the purpose of art, but quickly apologizes just before he might anger the policeman. Then he tells his listener about his plan to please both his masters and himself, and he is planning to paint a great piece of religious art that will show God, the Madonna, and of course, as center too. However, in the corner of the painting, he will include a picture of himself watching the scene, and then he fantasizes aloud how a sweet angelic sleep of a thing will address him in the painting, praising his talent and authorship until the hothead husband comes and forces Lippi to hide away in the painting. And then Lippo bids goodbye to his listener and heads back home. So, in that way, it ends.